There's a story from the Deep South that was never printed in the papers, not because it wasn't true, but because too many men were willing to pay for it to be forgotten. It begins near Vicksburg, Mississippi, sometime after the war, when the world was still haunted by ghosts in gray coats and burned-out plantations that refused to die. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In the ruins of one such estate, Harrow Hill, they say a small man walked the empty fields. His name was Elias, a slave born with a twisted spine that left him no taller than a child. The planter who owned him, Josiah Harrow, was known for two things: his wealth and his cruelty. They said he laughed when Elias tried to pray, called him a devil's joke, and once tied him to a post for 3 days because he refused to sing at dinner. But stories like these don't fade. They ferment. And one night, when the world seemed tired of keeping secrets, fire came crawling up the walls of Harrow Hill. No one knew how it started. They only knew what they found afterward: the ashes of Josiah Harrow, his wife, and their 3 children, all blackened beyond recognition. The only survivor was the dwarf slave, Elias, who disappeared before dawn, leaving behind a single set of small footprints leading toward the bayou. For decades, people said he died there, but others whispered something worse: that he didn't die at all. That he came back, richer than his master, owning men who once spat at his feet. And sometimes, when someone new buys the land where Harrow Hill once stood, they say a man comes knocking at their door, barely 4 feet tall, wearing a preacher's coat, and asking if they'd like to hear a story about fire. Elias was born in the dirt, behind the sugar mill. His mother, a field worker, his father unknown. The other slaves used to say God made him small so he could survive in small places, under the floorboards, in the walls, in the cracks of a world that never wanted him. He had a strange way of looking at people. Never up, never down, but through. Like he was memorizing something you didn't know you were giving away. Josiah Harrow hated that look. He used to say Elias had a devil hiding in his ribs. By 12, Elias was no longer allowed near the main house. Too many guests had complained of hearing him whisper prayers under the floor or scratching verses into the walls with bits of coal. When one of the planter's sons fell ill, Mrs. Harrow blamed Elias's witchcraft. They dragged him out by his ankles and beat him until the boards were slick with blood. But Elias didn't scream. He just stared at them, bleeding, lips moving soundlessly. Some say he was cursing them. Others say he was forgiving them. Years passed. The war came. The South burned. But Harrow Hill stood untouched, too proud, too rich to fall. Josiah Harrow made deals with soldiers, hid silver in the walls, and kept Elias as his servant, even after emancipation. Paper laws don't change blood, he'd say, and Elias would nod quietly, polishing the man's boots. Then, in the final winter before the fire, something changed. Elias started keeping a small book under his pillow, pages filled with strange diagrams, circles, and names written backward. He spoke less, worked faster, and at night, people claimed to hear him humming under the oak tree where the family's slaves were buried. One night, a field hand swore he saw Elias speaking to someone in the dark, someone no taller than a child, but made entirely of smoke. The man never came to work again. Whatever Elias was doing in those woods, it was no prayer. It was preparation. That winter came earlier than anyone expected. The crops froze, the livestock died in their pens, and Harrow Hill's once rich soil turned gray and brittle as bone. Josiah Harrow blamed his workers. He blamed the freedmen. And most of all, he blamed Elias. Neighbors said they could hear Harrow shouting long after midnight, his voice echoing across the empty fields like thunder. Then, the next morning, Elias would be seen quietly sweeping the veranda, his eyes sunken, lips cracked, moving as if he hadn't slept at all. The plantation cook, an old woman named Maribel, was the last one to speak kindly of him. She said Elias would sit near the fire and whisper about balancing the scales. He'd ask strange questions. Can a man's soul burn slower than his body? If someone dies in hate, does their shadow stay behind? Maribel told him to stop talking like that, but Elias just smiled and said, "The Lord's been listening to them too long. It's time he heard from us." By Christmas Eve, strange things began happening in the house. The clock in the hallway started ticking backward. Milk curdled seconds after being poured. The Harrow children said they saw someone small standing at the foot of their beds at night, humming softly, a tune their mother didn't recognize. When Josiah demanded to know who it was, every servant swore they hadn't left their rooms. That's when he went to Elias's quarters and found the book. It wasn't written in English, or not any English he could read. The pages were filled with circles, symbols, and names written over and over again. Some of the names were his family's. He burned the book that night, but the fire wouldn't go out. It spread to the curtains, the table, the floor. The whole house should have gone up in flames right then. Yet somehow, it didn't. Elias put it out himself, barefoot, his small hands blistered, but calm. When Harrow asked him why he did it, Elias said, "Because it wasn't time yet." The night it happened, the moon was blood red. The wind carried a strange hum through the cypress trees, like voices tuning an unseen choir. Harrow Hill stood silent. Every window shuddered against the storm. But those who lived near the plantation said they could hear something moving inside, something rhythmic and low, like a chant wrapped in smoke. Elias was nowhere to be found that day. Josiah had locked him in the smokehouse after finding strange marks carved into the barn doors, circles with crosses inside, and a single word scratched beneath them: balance. But when the overseer went to bring Elias his supper, the door was already open. The lock hung twisted, blackened, like it had been struck by lightning. Inside, the chains were melted into the dirt. At that same moment, the Harrow family sat at dinner. The candles burned low, the silverware glowed faintly, and Mrs. Harrow kept glancing toward the hallway as if someone were standing there. The children refused to eat, saying they could hear singing from the walls. Josiah cursed, slammed his hand on the table, and ordered everyone to be silent. That was when the clock began ticking again, but this time, it wasn't ticking backward. It was beating, like a heart. The house trembled, plates shattered, the air filled with the smell of ash and something sweet, molasses or blood, no one could tell. Then came the scream, not a human scream, but something dragged through fire. When the neighbors arrived the next morning, Harrow Hill was gone. Nothing but smoldering timbers and the sound of wind moving through the ruins. The family's remains were found together in the dining room, charred beyond recognition, hands still clasped as if in prayer. And in the ashes, they found footprints, small ones, too small for any grown man. They led straight from the dining room to the front gate, then vanished. They say the fire burned, for 3 days, even through the rain. And when it finally died, the ground beneath the house had turned to glass. Months passed. The land where Harrow Hill once stood refused to grow anything. Even the weeds curled and blackened, as if scorched from beneath. The county tried to sell the property, but every buyer backed out. One said he saw someone standing by the burned gate, a small figure in a long coat, staring at him without blinking. Another swore that when he went to sign the deed, his pen filled with blood instead of ink. Years turned into decades. The story of Elias became something parents whispered to frighten children. "Don't mistreat the small or the strange," they'd say, "or Elias will come and measure your soul." Then, in 1912, a man named Reverend Cole purchased the land. He said he wanted to build a new church there, to cleanse it of old sins. He brought his wife and daughter, set up tents, and began the first sermons right where the Harrow family had died. On the first Sunday, the townsfolk gathered out of curiosity. The Reverend spoke passionately about redemption, about how even the wicked soil could be reborn. But as he preached, people began to murmur. The Reverend's voice trembled, then deepened. His spine seemed to curl inward, his hands gripping the podium as if something inside him hurt to contain. One woman screamed when she saw his face under the morning light. His eyes had gone pitch black. He smiled, showing small, uneven teeth. "You built your church on ashes," he said, his voice both gentle and burning. "And the ashes still remember." The tent collapsed in flames. Those who survived swore the fire burned in perfect circles around the crowd, leaving only the center untouched. Where the Reverend stood, unburned, his small shadow stretching toward the ruins of Harrow Hill. "If you're still watching," the narrator whispers, "you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline?" Some say that after that day, a man calling himself Reverend Elias Cole traveled through the South, buying up old plantations, preaching about balance, about debt, about the cost of mercy. He always walked with a cane. He never took off his gloves. And behind him, towns burned. For 50 years, people claimed to see him. In Louisiana, in Georgia, in the Carolinas, a small man with a crooked back and a silver cane, preaching to crowds that grew too quiet, too fast. Wherever he went, churches burned within a week. He spoke of the old masters and the debts left unpaid. He told people to dig beneath their altars, their houses, their fields. Those who did found strange things: rings, children's shoes, shackles with names carved inside them. Some said the earth was coughing up its guilt. Others said Elias was collecting it. In 1938, a journalist named Henry Mott decided to follow him. He tracked Elias through a string of burned chapels from Alabama to Arkansas. Each fire left the same mark scorched into the walls, a circle crossed by an X. Inside that symbol, ash always settled in the shape of a child's footprint. Henry finally found him outside a town called Stillwater. He said Elias was preaching to no one, standing in a graveyard under a dead oak, whispering, "We were never freed, only forgotten." When Henry asked who he was talking to, Elias looked up and smiled. "Them," he said, pointing to the empty graves. Henry's notes end there. His body was found a week later in his hotel room. Everything burned but the notebook, which somehow survived untouched. Inside were the words, "He said he was the master now, and that we're all still working for him." After that, no one spoke of Elias again. But in Mississippi folklore, a phrase took root. The balance is due. It became a warning, whispered when fires started without cause, or when a preacher came to town speaking too softly about redemption. Even now, historians argue whether Elias ever existed, or if he was just the ghost of guilt itself, a story born from the South's refusal to look itself in the mirror. But those who visited what's left of Harrow Hill say the ground still feels war. And if you leave something small, like a coin or a nail, by the old oak, it's always gone by morning. They say the last time Elias was seen was in 1964, during another Mississippi summer swollen with heat and silence. A family named Crane had bought the land that once held Harrow Hill. They were Northerners, didn't believe in ghost stories. They built a new house, modern and square, right over the old foundations. The neighbors warned them not to dig too deep. The Cranes laughed. They hired machines, ripped out the roots of the cypress, and unearthed the glassy soil left behind from that fire nearly a century before. Under it, they found iron loops and bits of chain fused together, warped as if melted from the inside. They took it as scrap and threw it in the woods. That night, their youngest son woke screaming. He said there was a man in his room, small, wearing a preacher's coat, whispering that they'd taken what wasn't theirs. His parents found nothing. The next morning, the boy's footprints led outside. Bare, tiny, pressed deep into the ash-colored soil near the oak. 2 nights later, the house caught fire. The flames burned cold blue, moving from the inside out. When the firefighters arrived, the air smelled not of smoke, but of iron and molasses. The Cranes were found together in the doorway, as if frozen mid-run, their skin untouched, but their eyes burned black. The fire marshal's report listed the cause as unknown electrical, but locals know better. Sometimes, travelers passing that stretch of road see a faint glow among the trees, a single figure standing where the house used to be, holding something small that shines like glass. If you slow down, he looks up. If you stop, he starts walking toward you. And when you drive away, you can still smell that sweetness in the air. Because some debts don't die. They wait. They remember. And somewhere in the deep, dark South, where the soil still hums with old suffering, a small man in a long coat walks the empty fields, tapping his silver cane against the earth, counting softly under his breath. 1 for the master, 1 for the man, 1 for the fire that never ends,